Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a massive historical deconstruction. We're going to trace the sprawling 400-year, three-act history of the British Empire. We'll follow it from its incredibly scrappy, humble beginnings, right to its absolute global dominance, and finally, its incredibly dramatic collapse. Grab a seat and get ready, because this is a story that absolutely still shapes the world you live in today.
So, here's the core question we really have to answer. If you looked at England in the 15th and 16th centuries, you'd see a poor, fractured island nation. They didn't have massive gold reserves like Spain, and they definitely didn't have sprawling armies like France. They were vulnerable, desperate, and kind of gloomy. Yet, somehow, this tiny island ended up controlling a staggering 24% of the entire globe. Seriously, how on earth did that happen?
Well, let's get into the roadmap for how we're going to unpack this. Part 1, the hunger of a poor island. Part 2, trade, company, and cruelty. Part 3, the era of machines and opium. Part 4, the bloody loot of Africa. And finally, Part 5, world wars and the fall.
All right, kicking things off with Part 1, the hunger of a poor island.
Picture this. It's the era of Queen Elizabeth I, and the royal treasury is basically running on fumes. England is surrounded by enemies, deeply paranoid, and heavily leaning into a fortress mentality against superpowers like Spain. They had to look outward to survive. But right off the bat, we absolutely have to debunk a massive historical myth. You often hear that the British Empire started with these noble, civilized trading missions. The grim reality? The very first brick of this empire was laid through state-funded piracy and maritime guerrilla warfare. England literally didn't have the cash to build an empire, so their only option was to just steal from the Spanish who did.
Enter a group known as the Sea Dogs. Now, these guys were essentially officially sanctioned, crowd-funded English pirates. Famous figures like Sir Francis Drake were handed a letter of marque by the Queen. This basically gave them a free pass to loot Spanish treasure ships and completely massacre their crews, just as long as they shared the massive profits with the crown. This early guerrilla warfare on the seas rewarded utter ruthlessness with literal knighthoods, and it established the absolutely crucial early blueprint for British naval dominance.
Moving right along to Part 2, trade, company, and cruelty. This marks the dark shift from maritime piracy over to land colonization.
Those early land settlements in America, like Jamestown, were outright nightmares. During the brutal winter of 1609, settlers literally ran out of food and descended into madness and cannibalism just to survive. Colonization required a complete and total abandonment of mercy. And let me tell you, that ruthlessness scaled up fast. Imagine, just for a second, if a massive tech giant today, like Apple or Google, suddenly built a heavily armed private army, conquered sovereign nations, minted its own currency, and started relentlessly taxing foreign citizens. Sounds insane, right? Well, that was exactly the East India Company. It wasn't just a business, it was a ruthless corporate state acting within a state. And the devastating result of that power brings us to this staggering number, 10 million. I really want that to sink in. That is the number of people who starved to death during the 1770 Bengal famine. And this wasn't just some unpredictable natural disaster. It was a direct result of the East India Company ruthlessly extracting extreme taxes during a severe drought. They were perfectly willing to let millions of Indians die just to keep their share prices looking good back in London. Now, what was the actual economic engine driving all this wealth? It was a terrifyingly efficient, brutal system known as the triangle trade. Let's break it down. From Europe, weapons and textiles were shipped down to Africa. From Africa, enslaved human beings were shipped to the Caribbean in the unimaginable horrors of the Middle Passage. And finally, from the Caribbean, sugar, rum, and immense wealth flowed right back to Europe. Human lives were literally turned into raw materials to fuel early British capitalism. Over 11.2 million. That's how many African people were forced into this brutal slave trade by European powers. For the people trapped on those British ships, the conditions were hell on earth. 1 in 5 enslaved people died from disease, starvation, or despair during the journey. We have to remember that this horrific, systemic human suffering was the very foundation that funded modern British banks and built their gleaming cities.
Which brings us to Part 3, the era of machines and opium. All that immense wealth generated from slavery and colonial looting, well, it bankrolled some massive technological leaps. Britain was entering the Industrial Revolution, creating this terrifying, smoke-filled machine of global exploitation. But hold on, the Industrial Revolution wasn't just some triumphant march of progress. The human cost was incredibly dark. The empire was built on exploiting the most vulnerable citizens right at home. sending literal 4-year-olds into deadly factory chimneys and forcing the poor into 16-hour shifts. And at the exact same time, they were purposefully destroying foreign industries abroad, like ruining highly skilled Indian textile weavers just to flood the global market with cheap British cloth.
Around this time, the world entered what historians like to call Pax Britannica, basically a period of supposed global peace from 1815 to 1914. But let's be completely real here. This peace was a total illusion. It was heavily enforced by naval gunboats threatening to literally blow up the ports of any sovereign nation that dared to refuse British market control or trade terms. And honestly, there is no better example of this aggressive gunboat diplomacy than China. See, Britain was draining its silver reserves buying Chinese tea. To balance out this massive trade deficit, Britain deliberately and illegally smuggled Indian-grown opium into China, ultimately turning millions of Chinese citizens into addicts. When the Chinese government rightfully stepped in and destroyed the illegal opium, Britain's response was to destroy Chinese coastal cities and steal Hong Kong. It was essentially a state-sponsored drug cartel enforced by a world-class navy. All right, let's step into Part 4, the bloody loot of Africa.
By the time we hit the late 19th century, the empire's hungry eyes had shifted away from the Americas and Asia toward the so-called Dark Continent. They were completely driven by the discovery of unimaginable wealth in gold, diamonds, and rubber. So, in the 1880s, European powers held the Berlin Conference, and get this, politicians literally sat around a table drawing arbitrary straight lines on a map of Africa, blindly dividing ancient tribes and forcing hostile groups together. Not a single African leader was even in the room. These thoughtless borders, drawn by men like Cecil Rhodes just to maximize resource extraction, are the direct blueprint for countless modern African civil wars and geopolitical instability today.
We have to understand that this conquest of Africa wasn't warfare, it was, quite frankly, industrialized slaughter. Take Sudan, for example. 11,000 Sudanese warriors fighting with traditional weapons were massacred in a matter of hours. The British, they lost just 48 men. This perfectly captures the devastating technological mismatch brought on by the Maxim gun, which was the world's first automatic machine gun.
I want you to just take a second and really let this chilling African proverb sink in. When the missionaries came, they had the Bible, and we had the land. When we opened our eyes, we had the Bible, and they had our land. It perfectly and so tragically sums up the devastating contrast between the British Empire's proclaimed civilizing mission and the brutal reality of absolute, unyielding theft. And that brings us to our final act, Part 5, World Wars and the Fall.
So how in the world does an empire this massive, this wealthy, and this technologically advanced actually collapse? Well, it all comes down to deep British hubris, massive overextension, and global conflicts that finally broke the empire's spine. The cracks really started showing in South Africa during the Boer War. It was a grueling conflict against Dutch settlers that exposed some serious British military fatigue. Unable to win a standard battle, Britain introduced a horrific, reputation-destroying tactic: concentration camps. They imprisoned Boer families, leading to the agonizing deaths of 27,000 women and children from disease and starvation. The mask of British civilization was completely slipping on a global stage.
Now watch how incredibly fast these dominoes start to fall. After the Boer War exposes their military weakness in 1899, World War I hits in 1914, completely bankrupting the nation and totally shattering their illusion of invincibility. This sparks unstoppable violent rebellions right in their own backyard, with the Irish Easter Rising in 1916. And it finally culminates in 1947, when India breaks free, officially tearing the prize jewel right out of the imperial crown.
So, stepping back, what did a 400-year global empire actually leave behind? Well, we are left with arbitrary borders that are absolutely still fueling bloody conflicts across the Middle East and Africa. We're left with the systemic, pseudo-scientific roots of global racial inequality. We see massive historic wealth transfers that literally still fund modern Western banking centers today, all alongside the incredibly complex global spread of the English language, international trade routes, and railway systems.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative question to chew on today. When you look at the news right now, when you see our modern borders, our ongoing global conflicts, and the stark, massive economic inequality between the global North and South, are we actually living in a post-colonial world? Or are we all still just living in the long, dark shadow of the British Empire?